started. Thank you guys so much for coming, and welcome to Science on Tap, hosted by the Science Policy Society at Penn State. And if you're not familiar with our group, we are a student organization consisting mostly of graduate students in different areas of science and engineering, and we are committed to advocating for the goals of the scientific community. And this can be done in a few ways. This involves supporting laws and regulations that are backed by science, and also we try to play a role in shaping the nation's scientific research priorities, especially if our research is federally funded. So this can look like a few things. We do interface with legislators at our annual trip to Washington, D.C. We also write policy memos throughout the year on issues we are interested in, and we also try to connect with the community, which is what we're doing at this event tonight. Community engagement is very important to us because even if our neighbors are not the ones writing laws, they are voting for the people who do. And if we're federally funded, that means that our neighbors' tax dollars are supporting our research. So that's sort of the idea of Science on Tap. We're trying to facilitate engagement between scientists and the community, and in doing so, we're also challenging researchers to practice their communication skills with non-technical audiences as well. Because of course, what is the point of science advocacy if we're not able to communicate efficiently? So we try to host Science on Tap about once a month, and at each of these events, we feature a different research topic. And so tonight, we're going to have two speakers discussing the connections between forests and human health. And they're going to be doing this from two different perspectives. One is more focused on how human nutrition changes when forests are threatened, and the other is more about how disease outbreaks may stem from human-wildlife interactions. So our first speaker tonight is going to be Dr. Bronwen Powell. She is an associate professor of geography, African studies, and anthropology, and she's also a research associate for the Center for International Forestry Research. And then next we'll have Dr. Sagan Friant, who is an assistant professor in anthropology and a member of the Center for Infectious Disease Dynamics in the Huck Institute of Life Sciences. So each talk is going to be about 15 minutes, and then we're going to open the floor for discussion amongst the audience. So just please save questions until the end. So please welcome our first speaker.
Hi. Thanks so much for that introduction. So talking about policy, today I wanted to connect my talk to some international policy making that's happening right now, and that is the COP. Many of you will hear COP and think of the climate change COP, but there's actually a COP that's also hosted by the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and it's opened yesterday in Montreal. And the focus is the decline in biodiversity globally and what to do about it. And so thinking about the role of forests for human health is one of those solutions. There's, since I've been doing this, I guess 15, 20 years now, there's been a really increased awareness of the importance of biodiversity in forests for global well-being, human survival, right? Ecosystem services is a term that many people have now heard of. Many people are aware of some of the links between forests and human health. Some that we won't talk about today include pollination, water and air regulation, soil regulation. There's some really interesting research that shows that if you spend time walking in a forest, your stress hormones reduce more than if you just go for a walk in an urban area. So in that context, there's an array of work linking forests to human health. Today I'm going to talk about the role of forests for nutrition. So I'll start by inviting you to think about the last time you ate a forest food or wild food. And while some of you probably don't forage as much as I do, there's lots of things that you eat, including mushrooms and trout and lots of fish and seafood that are all wild things that depend more or less on forests for their production and sustainability. here in Pennsylvania, not that many people eat these things, probably trout, but a lot of people eat venison. And if you're from an urban area or not from Pennsylvania, you maybe don't understand the magnitude of how much venison is consumed. And so this study collected tag information from offtake for a number of states, and they found that in Pennsylvania we're approaching 4 pounds per year per person. And if you exclude urban populations, that approaches 2.5 pounds per person per year. So if you put that in the context of dietary recommendations that say we shouldn't consume more than 70 pounds of red meat a year, that's a significant, not a huge chunk, but not a tiny chunk either. And that use of wild food here in Pennsylvania is fairly representative of the types of ways we see people using forest and wild foods globally. There's a bunch of different typologies of how people use wild foods. And systems like in Papua, Indonesia, where people are dependent on sago palm, which is processed to make a sticky porridge, along with bushmeat, and these are sago palm worms, are absolutely the rarest typology of wild food use globally. Most communities don't depend on wild food for their staple, the majority of the calories in the diet. Even communities like the Gums in Ethiopia, who are seasonally very highly reliant on wild foods like bamboo shoots and wild yams and mushrooms and bushmeat, even those communities are in the minority globally. Most communities either supplement their diet or have limited food use. And so those of us here in Pennsylvania that eat some venison, maybe do some foraging, we fall into that category of limited wild food use, but we're still using them. And then there are communities in other parts of Africa where the wild foods aren't providing the majority of the calories, but they are providing significant foods that people are consuming. And one of the key things about wild and forest food use is the types of foods that are being consumed. Most around the world, most of the wild and forest foods that are consumed are fruits, vegetables, meat, fish, and mushrooms, right? So when global conservation policymakers, forest conservation economists try to do calculations about the importance of wild foods to promote why we need to protect forests, the FAO State of the World's Forests did this calculation in 2016 to try and estimate how much of the calories in people's diets globally come from forest foods, and they found very, very little calories coming from wild food. However, a lot of the wild meat, a big chunk of, a lot of the meat in a lot of studies, a lot of the leafy vegetables in a lot of rural communities around the world, and there's less evidence for fruit, but that's true of fruit as well, do come from forests and trees. In fact, over 50% of the fruit consumed globally is produced on trees, some of which is wild, some of which is produced in agroforestry systems. And so when we turn from a focus on calories, and we think about the importance of wild foods for communities around the world in terms of nutrition and micronutrient intake, we get a very different picture. And we see that in the few communities where studies have been done, wild foods are contributing a very significant chunk of these key micronutrients that are essential for people's well-being. Micronutrient deficiency is responsible or associated with 45% of child mortality globally, right? And so there's a study from Madagascar that shows that removal of bushmeat from the diet would lead to an increase in anemia of almost 30%, right? That's 30% more kids with anemia. Remembering that anemia is associated with stunting, associated with poor school attainment, associated with permanent cognitive impairment, associated with ability to perform work, associated with national level GDP. And so the absence of those wild foods from the diet can be really important for broad human health and well-being. And then there are lots of communities where wild foods aren't providing all of the calories in the diet, all of the energy, but the majority of the diet, these are photos from Burkina Faso. It's true across most of semi-arid West Africa. More than 50% of the leafy vegetables in the diet come from tree leaves. In Burkina Faso, I think it's like 90% of the dietary fat in the diet comes from shea butter from a wild tree. A huge portion of the fruit are wild fruit, and a lot of the legumes come from a leguminous tree called parquia that is fermented into a seasoning that's added to sauces. And so it's not surprising then that there's now a very robust growing body of evidence that links deforestation and, well, firstly we linked forest cover to fruit and vegetable consumption, and in some contexts also animal source food consumption, so meat and fish. But across Africa, we see a relationship with forest cover and fruit and vegetable consumption and diet quality. Most recently, using panel data, we've been able to show a causal relationship between deforestation and fruit and vegetable consumption in Tanzania. So that suggests that that deforestation is actually causing the loss of fruits and vegetables from diets, which gives pretty good impetus for making sure those forests stay in the landscape. Wild foods, of course, are not just important for nutrition and diet, they're also central to people's identity and culture. For Native American communities, wild foods are an important connection to land and to place. Wild food species are seen as relatives, relations, that Native communities have a responsibility to protect and take care of. And so then when we think about the impacts of climate change and the loss of things like salmon from the diet and what that does to people's identity, cultural identity, we can see how through food, some Native American and indigenous North American activists are linking climate change to cultural genocide or genocide. This importance of wild food for indigenous communities complicates decision-making that's happening at the CBD COP right now, because 2/3 of the world's intact ecological systems are under some form of indigenous community management. And there's good evidence that shows that putting a protected area in place, even if it's associated with tourism, can have negative implications for communities' diet and nutrition. And so, as we think about what's, if you follow the news, the COP right now are calling to conserve 30% of the Earth's surface by 2030. Even more extreme are calls to protect half of the Earth's surface. And what that means depends on the level of protection, but what that means for people's ability to continue using wild foods, forest foods, is then complicated by these issues around justice and who is supposed to carry the burden of global biodiversity conservation, right? Who has the health outcomes? Who has the outcomes of that when our global community is benefiting from that global level of conservation. Okay, I'm done. I don't know how long that was.
Thank you so much. All right, next up is Dr. Sagan Friant.
I'm going to try and talk really loud to drown out what's happening over there, so sorry if I get your eardrums. She can come up if she needs to. My name's Sagan Friant. I am in the Department of Anthropology and part of the Hub Institutes for the Life Sciences and the Center of Infectious Disease Dynamics. My lab is in Carpenter and also in this community in Nigeria called Unpat, which means I am tired because it takes about 20 kilometers to trek there from the nearest road. And our lab focuses on human-wildlife interactions and their health consequences. Hold on. It's okay. So in my previous life, I studied primate disease ecology, and so this is what brought me to West Africa. And I was interested in the social and ecological correlates of disease transmission in wildlife, which meant I looked at a lot of poop under the microscope. But when I was there collecting this poop and learning all of these beautiful monkeys' names, this is Bonnie. I was spending a lot of time living in hunting sheds with people who were hunting not the monkeys I was studying, but lots of other animals, including monkeys. And I became very interested in the fact that these people were vulnerable to a lot of the diseases that I was studying in wildlife. And also interested in the fact that my conception of what a bushmeat hunter was nothing like what it was. So this picture illustrates that engagement in hunting and wildlife handling, which I'll get to in a minute as a high-risk activity, is something that happens not just with men who enter as poachers, but from families, women, and children who are relying on that forest for their nutrition, as Bronwen so eloquently illustrated. So my research a lot is on some of the health consequences, so zoonotic diseases. Zoonotic diseases are any diseases transmitted from animals to humans. And these can be from livestock or wildlife. But a lot of zoonotic diseases that humans get, well, I should say, a lot of new diseases that humans get have zoonotic origins and are emerging in human populations. So emerging infectious diseases are any diseases that are increasing in incidence or geographic spread. And a majority of those are from animals, and a majority of those are from wildlife. So wildlife are a really important source of new infectious diseases that spread through human populations through a process called spillover, and occasionally cause pandemics like COVID-19. Hunting wild animals is a very visible, high-risk activity that has garnered a lot of attention as a driver of disease emergence in human populations. And so a lot of my work in Nigeria, living in these hunting sheds, that thing turned off, okay, was interested in what drives somebody to hunt. And so this is a typical hunting shed in Nigeria. These are the hammocks that me and my husband were staying in at the time, and he was in that one for like 48 hours puking because he had food poisoning in the middle of the forest. He just left so I can say that. And so my question was, what drives people after talking to people, hunting is considered a very undesirable livelihood, something that people were forced into for a lack of better alternatives. And so I conducted a study to see what drives people to hunt. So if you go into a community, what are the underlying factors that predict whether a person hunts or not? And turns out that's low education, large family size, as well as family and cultural tradition that are driving people into this practice. And a very common thing that people said during their interviews when I asked why they were hunting was to feed their children. I took that literally, as I'll talk about soon, and designed a whole study about the nutritional significance of bushmeat into local diets, but also feeding your children meant more than just feeding your children. It's giving them funds to go to school, it's building your house. This is an image of some of the children from Umpat. It's 20 kilometers away from the nearest school, so they go and they spend time with relatives in a larger city, and they're bringing bushmeat and other things to compensate for their time there in informal ways. But I did design a study that looked at the nutritional composition of bushmeat. So it's really interesting. If you talk to someone like Bronwen, they're like, of course bushmeat is important. But if you talk to the conservation community, which is really prevalent around this area, they're like, that's not important for nutrition. People are just selling it, they're not eating it. And so it's actually a really important question in areas where there's a lot of trade in wildlife. So we conducted a lot of interviews where we talked to people about what they ate, but also how they contacted animals in other areas. And then we also took measures of people's nutritional status, height, weight, mid-arm circumference to look at how that translated to human health. And some of the findings where we tried to correlate the consumption of bushmeat with household level food security. We found that food secure households, so this is my idealistic picture of a food secure household, especially because a butterfly was just flying across at the time I took it without me knowing, are more likely to consume bushmeat. So it's providing a buffer against food insecurity in a lot of these areas. And when you look at what the species composition of that bushmeat is, it tends to be large-bodied animals, like large rodents, ungulates like bush pig, that are really desirable. Whereas in food insecure households, where people are struggling to feed themselves, they're consuming less bushmeat, but they're also consuming different types of animals. So this includes small-bodied animals like bats, kuzimans, which is mongoose, and pangolins. So it's a much broader diversity of meat that they're consuming, and a lot of these animals are really important hosts for zoonotic diseases. So there's association with potential vulnerability and food insecurity. In addition to being nutritionally important, it's not just the children going to school that are trading meat, but it's really traded in this area of West Africa on a commercial basis. So a lot of the meat from even 20 kilometers in the middle of the forest where there's no road and you have to trek in and out is making its way to urban markets, which means that bushmeat is a unique economic resource in that it accumulates high economic value the further away it gets. And so it's really valuable in urban centers compared to rural areas. But it also means that these animals and the pathogens that they carry are traveling long distances and increasing risk in urban centers. So to bring this to some of the ideas that Bronwen was talking about, this is my field site where I've worked for 15 years. This is a biodiversity hotspot on the border of Cameroon and Nigeria that is really unique species richness and likely very unique viral richness and diseases that we may not know about. And so I've designed a lot of my career around working in a high area of biodiversity, thinking that this is the area where they're at most risk of zoonotic diseases. And this is the basis of our project, the Cross River Ecology and Health Project, and my fabulous research assistants who do a lot of the work with me. But interestingly, more lately, I've been engaged in research that's focused on specific disease systems. So this includes mpox, formerly known as monkeypox, Lassa fever, which is a hemorrhagic fever virus caused by rodents, also in Nigeria. These are both deadly diseases. And in shifting my study to disease-specific systems, I moved out of the forest, and it's brought me to really human-dominated ecosystems. And so it's not the areas in the middle of the forest that we're seeing these outbreaks. It's these areas where the forest is being destroyed that we're starting to see abundance of rodents, rodent-borne diseases, and new human diseases. So there's lots of reasons why that might be the case, but I think it's an interesting observation. So as human, the overarching main point here is that as human behavior and ecology is changing and environments are changing, we're coming into more frequent contact with animals in a diversity of ways, directly, indirectly, contact that we want to have, contact that we don't want to have through pests and crop raiding and things like that. But we're also changing the ecosystems in ways that change the ecology of the infectious diseases. So it's changing the ecology of animal reservoirs that host these diseases and their probability of spilling over into humans. And so I think that it's important to recognize that environmental health, animal health are all really important components of human health, which is the underlying logic behind the idea of One Health, if you guys have heard of that. And it's important to think about biodiversity as being a pool of pathogens, but the destruction of biodiversity as the way that it's typically spreading within human populations and new diseases are emerging. So with that, I will finish, and then Bronwen and I would love to take any questions.
All right, any questions from the audience?
Okay, my question is mainly for Dr. Powell, but I'm interested in both perspectives. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on whether there's a correlation between depleted soil nutrients and depleted food nutrients, and whether that could, relate to the importance of getting our food from forests, which have really high
Food from forest. So what nutrients are in our foods are shaped by a lot of different things, and it's not well documented. There's a lot of error in the data. Things like climate and sunshine and water content impact the micronutrient content in meat and vegetables and fruit significantly. So certainly there are some studies that say when vegetables are grown as part of agroforestry systems, the yield is lower, but the micronutrient content might be higher. It's really emerging evidence right now. There is one study by colleagues in Ethiopia that showed that wheat grown adjacent to forested areas has higher protein, zinc, and other minerals in it, because in areas adjacent to forest, there's more manure because people are able to take their livestock to graze in the forest, and then the livestock come back to the farm, transferring nutrients from the forest to the farm.
Do you have anything to add? Any other questions from the audience? Here, actually, I'll have something you have here.
This is another one for Dr. Powell. I was wondering if you'd be willing to share what your favorite wild food is. I'd love to hear.
I think ferns. There's a lot of different ferns consumed globally, and I love the ones from the rainforest of Borneo, and I grew up picking fiddlehead ferns in southern Ontario, so I think they're what started me down this path. What's yours, Sagan?
Porcupine.
No further comments. Any other questions?
To what degree are conversations about nutrition and like disease spillover part of the conservation conversation? And like what would need to happen for them to be larger parts of that conversation?
They're becoming a very large part of the conversation in both good and bad ways. So I think the conservation community has really leveraged issues like COVID-19 to spread their agenda, or Ebola virus, sometimes to the detriment of their own messaging. So when you're in the middle of an Ebola outbreak and it's caused by human-to-human transmission, and you're using that to tell people to stop eating bushmeat, is undermining the evidence that shows that its origins are in bushmeat, but the whole Ebola outbreak came from one single transmission. I'm talking about Ebola for 2014 in West Africa. And so I think there are really important intersections as far as where conservation and disease ecology can meet. But it's important to use those widely, especially to gain trust in your communities that you're working with, and not leveraging misinformation or conveniently using parts of the truth. I think there's areas where conservation and disease ecology really meet, as far as like here in Pennsylvania, protecting forests to prevent Lyme disease. So there's really good evidence that in more biodiverse areas that Lyme disease is less of a problem, and it's in suburban areas where white-footed mice are really dominant that you see more Lyme disease. But there's also areas where it's leveraged inappropriately to put on bushmeat bans or close down wet markets, which sell a lot more than wildlife. That's important for food security. And so it's really important to use the evidence and to progress that argument and that intersection, but not to attach yourself to information that's not necessarily correct to push your agenda.
When I started my postdoc with the Center for International Forestry Research in 2012, almost nobody was doing forests and diet, forest and food security. Because of those statistics about, well, they contribute so little energy, wild foods aren't important. But the messaging has changed significantly to the point where the UN Forum on Forests, when they developed their targets for contributions of forests to the Sustainable Development Goals, now have 2 bullet points around the importance of forests for fruit and the importance of forests for nuts and nutrition. So there is a fairly significant change at the international scale. How well that trickles down to national level policymaking is certainly up for debate.
Hi, I was interested, you were mentioning that there's like higher transmissions in places where forests are being destroyed, and it seemed like you were evaluating that it's not necessarily due to consumption, it's like due to something else.
Yeah, so I think what I was talking, maybe you can correct me if I'm answering the wrong question, but that in a lot of areas, humans are changing the landscapes in ways that we always think about human risk in terms of overlap with reservoirs of zoonotic diseases and rates of contact with reservoirs of zoonotic diseases. But we can extend that to think about how humans are impacting the environment that changes the natural ecology of the disease and the reservoir. So one of the systems that I work in is Lassa fever, which is transmitted by the multi-mammate rat that has many breasts and has multiple litters of like 18 a year. It just produces prolifically. And its reproductive cycle is synced to human agricultural activities. So you see peaks in Lassa fever in the Nigerian population come right after the peaks in agriculture when the animals have a lot of resources and reproduce, and then you see peaks in humans. And in that context, I think, and our research is testing a lot of these hypotheses, is that humans are fundamentally driving the behavior and the ecology of the reservoir in ways that increase the density of the reservoir and thus the density of the pathogen in animals, but also in ways that increase that interface. So when humans go in and they disturb their croplands and they harvest all the crops or they burn the bush, then the rodents are driven out of their burrows, and that's when they actually come into human habitations, and that results in a lot of disease transmission. And so that's, I think, hopefully that was what you were getting at, but I think that it's not just, there's lots of evidence that this happens in other disease systems, and we tend to point to local interactions, like this person interacted with this animal and it led to transmission, so we need to stop that. So the index case of Ebola 2014 was a child interacting with a bat, so we think. But there's also evidence to suggest that mining activities and deforestation changed the migratory patterns of those bats, and that's what brought those bats to that boy's village in the first place. So it's a lot of these larger global processes that are leading to, that affect the ecology of the animal that are leading to transmission. And so I think we need to think more broadly about that.
So my question is also for the second gender, and I'm wondering how the general studies and potentially advice are received by the local communities that you're working with.
So we do a lot of work with our local community, so our research is very well received. I tend to try not to give advice. I try to share knowledge with them both two ways, but also telling people in these areas not to eat bushmeat is just not realistic.
I have a question for you, Sagan. If you can wrestle your glasses away from Kaya. So Sagan, when I worked in Papua, Indonesia, I read that the island of Papua has the highest rates of disease diversity on the planet. So I'm curious, yeah, infectious diseases.
Human infectious?
I think so. So when are you going to work in Papua?
When you invite me? I'll finish answering the other question though. So we try and do with every project some kind of community work with the community. So we've done one of the problems, so I talked about how there's no disease outbreaks in the community that I work in, and that might not be true. That might just be that they don't get detected, right? And there's very little access to healthcare. So one of the projects that we did brought in healthcare workers to do health checkups, but also to bring information about potential diseases from animals, because people hear it from conservation communities, but they don't hear it from health professionals, which I think is a big problem. We've also done projects where we've done alternative nutrition, and so it's a multifaceted problem that requires a lot of interventions or a lot of changes, but at least the nutritional component of it, if we can reduce some of the need-based consumption, maybe not the culturally preferred consumption or the trade, but at least the need-based consumption. So we did some backyard chicken husbandry by partnering with chicken breeders for rural areas. So we try to work with the communities, not just do our research, but also give back to them and use the information that they tell us to design those interventions, which which dramatically helps community relationships, and they're very thankful for a lot of that.
Any last questions? All right, well, let's thank our speakers again. All right, again, thank you all so much for coming out. I hope you enjoyed tonight's talks. We will be continuing Science on Tap again in January. I believe the next date is January 26th, so keep an eye out in your emails. But yeah, we'll see you again next semester.